Hello, everyone. We will be getting started in just a few seconds. We're waiting for more folks to show up. Okay, I have 1 o'clock. Russ, if you want to get started, let's go ahead.
Well, greetings, everybody, as we're getting started here. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Russ Testa. I'm going to be serving the moderator for this event, and I'm not moderating these great opportunities. I am the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Director for the Holy Name Province Franciscans on the East Coast. First of all, I want to thank you for attending this first of 2 webinars in our Encounter for Our Common Home National Catholic Campaign for Climate Solutions. I mean, it's exciting. This is, like, I'm usually not this excited during Holy Week, but this is really an exciting time. If you have not had a chance to register for this for the Encounter in Our Common Home campaign itself, and just been able to be a part of this, you can go to godsplanet.us/advocacy. You can also register for the second webinar, which will be on the 19th. Just some other quick housekeeping pieces. The webinar is being recorded, so just so it's being recorded, and there will be a link sent to you and everyone who registered the next 24 to 48 hours. It'll also be posted, I think, for sharing as well. The other thing is the chat is enabled, but we ask for questions purposes with our panelists that you use the Q&A box. The Q&A box is found at the bottom of your screen, if you haven't had a chance to use that before. It's also, if you can't see it where it says Q&A, it might be under the 3 dots that say more, as another place you might find Q&A. If you use the Q&A, that's the best way for us to not miss your question and to be asking that. So we're going to be doing the way this is going to go. We're going to have 3 wonderful kind of input people for us to bring this together. I'd like to begin though with prayer, and it's appropriate that we begin with prayer using from the prayer to our Creator from Fratelli Tutti. I think when we think about what our Holy Father Pope Francis is inviting us to, is to really develop with Fratelli Tutti a different way of encounter, a different way of kind of organizing ourselves and living solidarity, kind of embracing that aspect of our Catholic social tradition differently. So I invite you all to settle in this moment of prayer, recognizing God's present with us as God is always with us. And we say, Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth in our hearts a paternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world. A world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. So as we look at this opportunity to be together, kind of ask ourselves that we're here on this Tuesday of Holy Week, and I think it's actually very appropriate that we're here for this experience on Holy Week, and with the anticipation of Easter, and the Easter season being when we kind of kick off the advocacy and the visitation part of our Encounter for Our Common Home campaign. And it's appropriate, I think, as Christians, because we are people of hope. And Holy Week in itself is this moment where hope is kind of wanting to spread forth that kind of encounter of the experience of Easter, that resurrection experience. And Sometimes when we do this work of climate change and other kind of advocacy work, we can sometimes feel as if we're much like Sisyphus rolling that stone up the hill, only to have it roll back down the next day. But I'm reminded of a quote from Pope Francis about what he's talked about hope. And he says, Christian hope is not just a naive optimism that things will be better tomorrow, but a call to action to help make God's promise of salvation concrete today and every day. It means building day by day the kingdom of love, justice, and fraternity that Jesus inaugurated through concrete gestures. This building of hope through concrete gestures is what we're hoping to do in this campaign, this common home, this campaign of encounter for our common home. And today we're going to explore how do we go to the depth of what we're trying to do first and trying to understand why we're entering into this, why we're trying to do this. Since we're not going to get as much into the nuts and bolts of the advocacy ask itself, we can answer some questions on that if need be, but we're looking at, again, reminding ourselves why we're doing this. And it's the importance of understanding why we're doing this as a point of view of encounter. We really are trying to inherit this aspect of our tradition that's going to remind us to change the conversation, trying to figure out how do we break through some of the partisanship, to invite others, enlarging the number of people, and growing the number of people to be part of us in this encounter. So we're trying to cross through in our invitations and interacting, work with the senators, a way that helps us to kind of create some new bonds, new relationships, new ways of kind of living out solidarity, living out what Pope Francis is inviting us to and reminding us to in Fratelli Tutti. But we also do this in a time when there's, again, another war. There's already been so many wars and violence in our world, with the war in Ukraine. And in many ways, we're standing up against an experience of where the tragedy of Ukraine is understandably knocking off some of the experience and the emphasis on the need for addressing the climate catastrophe we're facing. The IPCC report that came out just last week or the week before, that weeks do go together for all of us. But as we see that, I think it's reminding us that there is still a need for us to bring this as a way of how do we counter that message of saying more and more fossil fuels, more and more energy independence, in a way that does not just say we really do need to have a sense of sustainability, a way that answers really the cry out of the earth and the cry out of those persons who are poor, as we try to develop some new options and new choices for us. So we're fortunate today to help us do this. And we have with us three speakers who each are going to, each in turn, kind of share some ways of helping us to do this. I'm going to introduce all three of the speakers right now, and then we'll have each of them they'll present they'll share their kind of wisdom, their kind of insights with us, and then there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So again, as you have questions that come up for the various speakers as they raise it, do feel free to answer those into the Q&A. Our first speaker will be Ms. Miriam Hidalgo. She's a Catholic writer and speaker who serves on the board of Catholic Climate Covenant. She has more than 20 years of experience in the fields of catechesis, youth ministry, and Hispanic ministry at the parish, diocesan, and national level. Miriam was the president of the Federation for Catechesis with Hispanic youth in the Hispanics in the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership from 2016 to 2019. And she has co-authored the book, The Joy of Adolescent Catechesis. Currently, Miriam is a wife and full-time mother and serves as a youth minister at her home parish. And she continues to provide ministerial services to parishes, Catholic parishes, dioceses, and other organizations throughout the country. Miriam will speak today about why advocacy and care for creation are an integral aspect of our faith. Our second speaker is Ms. Emily Burke. She's the social media manager for Catholic Climate Covenant and a doctoral student at the University of Madison, University of Wisconsin in Madison's Joint Sociology and Community Environmental Sociology program. There's a mouthful. She's a young adult Catholic activist, Emily, and as an activist, she has led successful divestment campaigns during her time at Creighton University. And she recently spoke directly with Pope Francis about climate change in the church as part of Loyola University Chicago's Building Bridges of North and South initiative. Emily will be able to speak with us about why we need to ask our senators to act on climate change, and particularly right now. Emily will be followed by our final presenter, Professor Michael Hebbeler. Mr. Hebbeler serves as the Director of Discernment and Advocacy Education in the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. He accompanies students exploring their respective vocations and trains them in community organizing and advocacy work. He is a member of South Bend's Near Northwest neighborhood and provides leadership in faith to St. Joe County, which is a faith-based organizing initiative that cultivates power through relationship building across religious, racial, and economic differences. Michael will speak to us about why our Catholic voices are so important and why we are using the word in particular of counter. Following, again, all speakers, we will have a chance for questions and answers. So again, please do put your questions and answers as you have them, questions for dialogue in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'm done with my part. I'm so excited to hear our first speaker, Miriam. So please, Ms. Hidalgo.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So yeah, the question, why are advocacy and care for creation integral aspects of our faith? I think it's a super important question because both advocacy and care for creation are vital parts of our Catholic social teaching. And, you know, a lot of people, when they hear Catholic social teaching or social justice, they don't really associate it with our Catholic faith, or they have sometimes some kind of negative connotations about it. It is thought of as something else, something separate from our faith. And this may be why so many people don't know, so many of our Catholic sisters and brothers are hesitant to embrace something like advocacy and care for creation. And the truth is they are a fundamental part of our Catholic faith. We're called to advocacy and care for creation. Now, as Catholics, as followers of Jesus Christ, you know, the one who spoke out against all forms of injustice, we too are called to help our sisters and brothers in need and to do all that we can to ensure that God's people and God's creation are not exploited and harmed. You know, on the website of the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, I love what it says in regards to care for creation. It says, care for the earth is not just an Earth Day slogan. It is a requirement of our faith. We're called to protect people and the planet, and this environmental challenge has fundamental moral and ethical dimensions that cannot be ignored. It's a really powerful statement. You know, I think of the story of creation found in Genesis, where we are told that God gave us this earth and gave us in abundance all of the seed-bearing plants and fruit as food. And we were entrusted to have, you know, dominion over all living things. And for much of humanity, we have sadly abused that trust. You know, our planet has now reached a breaking point, and it's really up to us to change that mindset and to help stop this exploitation. Sorry if you hear any noise back there. But we're called to see ourselves as stewards of the earth. We hear a lot about stewardship. Really, we're guardians and protectors of the planet. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 2415 states, humanity's dominion over living beings granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. Again, another powerful statement. The environmental effects are so great today. They are not only causing death and destruction of natural habitats, which affect millions of species and creatures, but it's also affecting a lot of harm to us human beings. You know, I have a couple of stories I'd like to share. I remember when I attended one of my first climate marches. I think it was about 8 years ago. And, I was mingling with so many people there. And I was asked by one of the organizers, because I'm like that, I like to know who's the organizer and what's behind it and all of that. And I remember them basically asking me, so who are you here with? And why was I there? And I said, well, first and foremost, I am a Catholic and I believe in protecting God's creation. I love nature and I want to ensure a future for our future generations. And this person stopped me right away and said, oh, wow, you're the first Catholic I've met today. And I remember thinking, wow, well, where are the rest of my sisters and brothers? And luckily I was with another friend. So I told them, well, there are 2 other Catholics here. So we're 2 technically. And I'm sure they're out there somewhere, but they didn't know about it. So after this, I decided to promote the next climate marches to the local parishes across my state. I also began to implement lesson plans on the care for creation when it came to faith formation for catechists and other church ministers, church leaders. I began to get more involved in care for creation programs and advocacy. I visited one of my senators with a group of young adults, and we explained why we believe in environmental justice and why they should help pass laws that help protect the planet. Another story I'd like to share is when I went to the Dominican Republic. I was on a health mission trip, and we visited a town there where the local water supply was being polluted by miners, and they were dumping toxic chemicals into the water. And the problem is the town people there really relied on this water as their source of life. And it was making people sick, and it was basically unsafe to use. Now, a local Catholic priest began to organize the people. They camped out in front of the entrance to the lake to stop the miners from coming and dumping more toxins into the water. And this got a lot of attention. It got a lot of media coverage because it helped bring awareness to the situation. I was so fascinated by this Catholic priest. A lot of the people there working with him weren't even Catholic, of course. A lot of them weren't even affiliated with any religions. But they followed this priest because he gave them a voice. He helped get their voices heard. That is advocacy. That is care for creation. I just think to myself, how can we not speak up for injustice? How can we not give a voice to the voiceless? How can we go about our lives knowing that there is serious environmental damage being done to God's beautiful planet? So in Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si, which many of us are probably familiar with, we recognize that it was written for all people living on this planet. But I really believe that we as Catholics should be the ones on the front lines of advocacy and care for creation. They are not separate aspects of our faith. They really are integral aspects of our faith, giving voice to the voiceless, to the needy, and protecting, taking up that call that mission that God gave to us from the very beginning of protecting and caring for his creation. Thank you.
Miriam, thank you so much. I appreciate your bringing the stories and how that experience, those encounters kind of helped to continue to shaping you in your journey. And I know we'll discuss that more as we move forward. Emily, please, if you could please share with us now, please.
Yes, hello. So I am here to talk about why we need climate action now. Why at this moment, why advocacy now, and sort of how we can take what Miriam so eloquently laid out as the integral aspect that advocacy is in our faith, and go forth through this campaign that we are putting on. So the first thing that I want to say about why we need Catholic climate action now is that this is nothing new, right? So this connection that Miriam laid out, this isn't something that we're discovering now. As early as 1971, so this is more than 50 years ago, Pope Paul VI wrote that we were, quote, creating an environment for tomorrow which may well be intolerable. He called environmental degradation a wide-ranging social problem which concerns the entire human family. Later in 1990, so again, more than 30 years ago, Pope John Paul II said, quote,
Emily, real quick, we're seeing your speaker notes, not your slides.
ah,
That's right. Thought it was just me, but it's you, it's everybody. Good notes though, good notes.
is that
There we
better?
go. That's
There we
perfect.
go.
There we go.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. Glad we got it figured out.
Okay,
Very good.
so yes, later in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI titled his World Day of Peace message, "If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation." So we all recognize Pope Francis and the great call he's put forth through Laudato Si, but this has not just been Pope Francis's issue. This is a Catholic issue. He's made this call loud and clear, but this is nothing new. So the science is not new. It may be more and more alarming, but it's nothing that we haven't known for decades. The Catholic connection to our faith is nothing new. The availability for solutions, for the most part, is not new either. So the whole idea is that it's time to stop waiting for more research, stronger evidence, or a more direct call. The time for action is now. So that leads us to ask sort of, what are we facing? What are we looking at? Some of the most important things that climate change threatens is more frequent and severe natural disasters. And we know this, right? We know the human suffering at stake. We see it clearly already. We see earthquakes and wildfires and hurricanes in the news. We know the damage that they cause and the suffering that they create. Another thing is food and water scarcities that will and are already leading to things like migrant and refugee crises. And so as climate change driven natural disasters displace populations, sea level rise drowns islands, land aridity passes the point of no return, all of these factors uproot people's lives and render their homes uninhabitable. So as climate change worsens, rates of migration will drastically increase. There's research from Cornell University that estimates that there will be 1.4 billion climate refugees by 2060 and 2 billion by 2100. So think about that, right? There's currently 7.7 billion people in the world. By 2060, about 20% of the global population risks climate-related displacement. So these issues that we're talking about, they're not small, right? As a young adult, 2060 is very much in my lifetime. I'm going to be around for this and sort of faced with these kind of crises that climate change precipitates. And another one is sort of civilization and ecosystem collapse. And that's kind of strong, alarming language, right? We're not talking about small increases in temperatures or loss of biodiversity. We're talking about actions today that directly threaten civilization and ecosystem collapse. And so a thing to remember is that while we might not be the ones that have to clean up this mess or sort of deal with the fallout, we are handing this crying earth down to future generations. All of this is really bleak, right? It's really distressing. A recently published IPCC report, the sixth assessment, says this quote. It sort of sounds the alarm saying, the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And so while it's easy to be immobilized by fear and anxiety, it's on us to find hope in all of this, right? So in February, my Catholic Climate Covenant colleague, Henry, Glenn, and I met with Pope Francis as part of a dialogue with university students. And we talked to him about climate change. We talked to him about the refugee crises that could happen and the role that our faith plays in action. And his support for our actions and the outpouring of support that we received from those who watched the encounter gave us really great hope. And so together we wrote a blog post for the Covenant following this encounter, talking about our experience and connecting it to the IPCC report that came out days later. And we said, quote, "We know the science and we understand our faith obligates action. We believe we have the tools to combat this crisis if we act with purpose and in solidarity with one another. The window of time to act might be closing, but so long as our hearts remain open, there is hope." But the hope rests in us, right? It's in our responsibility to act in this moment. And so this is why advocacy for climate investments now is so critical. And this is why we are inviting you to be part of the campaign Encounter for Our Common Home. So our action now has the potential to do a lot of good for the future, but realizing also that inaction now looks really, really bleak. So I'm going to finish quickly with a question that Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, and he poses to us, and that's, what need does the earth have of us? So I ask you to reflect on this question. What need does the earth have of us? What need does the earth have of you? And I hope that you can find it in your heart to respond with participation in this advocacy opportunity.
Thank you, Emily. That was really, yeah, wow. Really just a quick follow-up question just for you, Emily, before we turn to Michael, is could you restate the quote from Pope Paul VI? Many people were inspired by that, but they missed that kind of in the initial kind of conversation. So if you could repeat that, that'd be really helpful for people.
Yeah, he wrote, quote, "Creating an environment for tomorrow which may well be intolerable." So he called environmental degradation a wide-ranging social problem which concerns the entire human family. And so the significance of this, right, was that this was in 1971. So we didn't know a lot of what we know about climate change now. But in 1971, he connected it to our Catholic faith. And so that's sort of evidence to how integral it really is.
Right, and pairing that with our own Pope Francis, the way they were together, that's just, wow, it's very powerful. Thank you so much, Emily, appreciate that. Michael, if you could please kind of go next. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Russ, and thanks, Emily and Miriam. I'll just say a few words before we move into question and answer and conversation, but I'm struck by the similarity between the word vocation and advocacy. So they may not sound exactly alike, but if you spell them out and you look at the root, vocation from vocare and advocacy, advocare, to think about maybe vocation, what is calling me? But to put ad in front of that, advocare, to whom am I called? So to think about moving from that contemplative space of how is God calling me, to think about a community, to whom do I belong? For whom am I responsible? And I think a good illustration that I've long used in our vocational discernment courses that I think gets a lot of traction in Catholic spaces is the story of Elijah, and he's in the cave, and there's the fire and the wind and the earthquake and all this noise, and but how does God's voice eventually appear to him in that sort of soft breeze? And we talk about that still small voice within. How do we sort of tap into that? And we, in the past, we sort of, we use that as an exercise to sort of to grow in our attentiveness to how we might be being called. But the story actually continues. And what does God ask of Elijah? And God says things like, hey, I need you to go back to the city and anoint new kings over Syria and Israel. And I need you to appoint Elisha as prophet in your place. And to help you make this happen, God says, I'm going to muster the young leaders of the province and all the people and all the children of Israel, 7,000 in total. And so this move into political power into social change, into community organizing, really building relationships, to have the people, to have the power to be able to act and create change. This is all part of that calling story that for so long, I never got past the still small voice poetic part. But to think seriously, to whom am I called? And then what does that require of me? And notice that God did not say, I need you to jump on Facebook and like a bunch of stuff. And, think, and get into sort of passion debates inside your house about things. And all those things are good, but we need to move into the public space. And we need to do, the marches and the op-ed writing and all these things are good educational tools, and they can help mobilize, but ultimately we need to get at the table. We need to have a seat at the table with the decision makers whose choices determine our future. And so this is why we're pushing for these legislative advocacy meetings, because we live in a place where we do actually have access to the table. And yet we often think of ourselves as sort of passive consumers, or, I'll go out on election day, maybe cast a vote, but then it's up to the legislator to take it from there. And that is not the case. We are responsible for continually showing up at the table to engage with our legislators to move things forward in a way that we will all flourish. And to think of that very word, so what does it mean to be a representative? A representative of who? Well, legislators are meeting all the time with people that have all kinds of demands. We need to unify our voice, amplify our voice, and say, hey, we're here too. And we have a story to tell, and we are rooting our stories in our values. And those two things, the values and the stories, take care of a lot of what that advocacy, those legislative advocacy meetings look like. Just as Miriam was telling some personal stories, what are the personal stories that move you to get to the table? So, I can talk about when we discovered in my neighborhood, the contaminated soil from all the lead that was falling off the sides of our house. Now, that's not in the bill that we're talking about, or the provisions, but connecting that to the health issues and my fear as a parent for my children, and then connecting that to our community needs, and thinking about the state of Indiana, where I live, as the state with the most super polluters in the country. And so, I'm talking about the backyard where my kids are playing. Now we're sort of moving into the very air that we breathe throughout the state. Our legislators are members of the state. They're our neighbors. They are part of our community. So how do we sort of frame this as we're all in this together? And there is no need for this to be sort of antagonistic or combative. We're engaging, as we are called to do, in that framework of encounter. So we are engaging in relationship with our legislators, saying, how do we think about this together? And these are the stories we're bringing to you that we need you to hear, so that you can tell your constituents, and that together we can adopt the policies that will improve our quality of life, and will respond to that call, right? The call that's within us to act. But if we were listening closely, we start to maybe hear that call sound like the cry of the earth. And so in Catholic social teaching, looking at the principles of preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, what is more vulnerable right now than the earth? And then thinking about the principle call to community, call to family, community, and participation. Again, that's the language of call is in that principle. So what does it mean to be an active participant in this way, and no longer a passive consumer or someone that just sort of hopes or even prays? And all these things are important, but sooner than later, we need to act. And legislative advocacy gives us a pathway to get to the table, to engage our decision makers, to develop a relationship with them, because we know nothing happens in one meeting, but to begin to develop a relationship with them, so that over time we can work together to move in the direction that the earth so desperately needs. And I'll pause there.
Thank you, Michael. And again, thank you to Miriam, and thank you to Emily for bringing us there. As you have questions, people that are attending, please put them into the Q&A, and we will bring those up to our presenters to kind of do this as a dialogue as best we can with 150 people. And so while we're waiting for some of these questions, I have a question as the moderator to ask, and this is kind of to all of you. Oftentimes when we are confronted in bringing up this work of doing advocacy, we're confronted by two kind of roadblocks, or at least two kind of reasons why we're told not to do this. One is it's political, and where the church is not supposed to be political. So there's an aspect of the political piece that, but also because it's also can be controversial. A lot of times, there's also a question that one of our attendees asked, is sometimes the obstacle to encounter can appear in our local church leadership, at whatever level of leadership we want, doesn't want to bring things up because they're concerned about the concerns that other political parishioners might have. They kind of, again, that trying to avoid controversy. So how would each of you briefly answer kind of how do we respond to this kind of aspect of the call to kind of political activism, and also like dealing with the potential that it could be controversial, or maybe it will be controversial. And I'll turn to you first, Miriam, if you don't mind.
Sure, I definitely have been approached with these type of obstacles, and it has been brought up in a lot of the ministry formation that I've had in my past, and even during workshops on care for creation. There's a lot of hesitancy and a lot of sometimes I can say anger as far as why is this being talked about in a Catholic setting. But what comes to my mind is the pro-life movement, for example. Such a powerful movement. We know that there's a huge march in Washington, D.C. every year. There's a huge Catholic turnout. And I always ask people, well, why, as important as that is, why is it okay for us as Catholics to put so much energy in that and not so much energy for our planet, for caring for our home? It is just as important because it affects all of us. So I start from there because a lot of times when we hear about huge movements like this, I can only think of, and many other people can think of, the pro-life movement. It's so strong and solid, and we have yet to come to that, to that point where people see this as important. But when I think when it's relatable, when you're bringing it back to home, this is affecting you, this is going to affect our children, then it sort of brings it into perspective, I'll say. I'm sure my friends here have other things to add, so.
Russ, you're muted, but I think
Emily, how would you answer those concerns? I'm so good at making myself not. Emily, how would you, please?
Yeah, my first instinct to that question always is to think about the word political. Political has the Greek root polis in it. That's where it comes from, which means of the people. And the Catholic Church is a church of the people, right? So de facto, our Catholic faith calls us to be political. It calls us to stand up for the vulnerable and to, act for our brothers and sisters. And that is what being political means. So it doesn't have to be like sort of a dirty word, being political. I think that that's just part of it. That's part of the action that we're called to. As far as environmental issues and climate change being so controversial and politicized and polarized, that's where it starts to get difficult. But I always look to the sentiment of being prophetic, right? What does it mean to be a prophet? And at my most basic understanding of a prophet, it's someone who sees the world as it ought to be and sees the world as it is and looks to sort of bridge that gap. So if we see the world as it is right now, suffering from climate change, and the most vulnerable and future generations are the ones that are most severely affected, and we have the power to sort of do something about it. And then we know what the world ought to be, which is more equitable, more just, And we see a way to sort of bridge that gap. I think a really good way to do that is advocacy in action. And so to be a prophet requires sometimes speaking out on controversial issues, and it requires sometimes inserting yourself into uncomfortable conversations. But I think that's what our faith calls us to do.
Thank you, Emily. That's great. Michael, please.
Thanks, Miriam and Emily. Yeah, I'm just thinking about Holy Week and Jesus not hanging out in the sort of in Galilee or on the sort of edge of the sea. He moves into Jerusalem. He goes into Jerusalem, into the city where the power is. And I think that, you know, I'll speak for myself as a lifelong Catholic. We've been more or less trained to be obedient. And that's sort of been my experience of the church in this sort of this hierarchy. And I think we are growing, you know, painfully with scandals and other things to recognize that we all have a role. And we are called to be, as Emily said, sort of active participants and guiding the future that we want and guiding the institutions that we want. And I think Pope Francis has been a very helpful model in bringing in more people, clerics and laity alike, to engage in the kind of dialogue, to do the kind of storytelling that is required for all voices to be heard and therefore to be honored as we move forward in healthier ways. And I think that and I think that's part of the political realm, as Emily really sort of helpfully broke down the root of the word. And so I think we need to do better sort of education and framing around what that actually means to engage politically. I mean, in some sense, everything is political. I also appreciate Miriam bringing up the pro-life model. I mean, I think typically Catholics don't challenge that. It's like, oh, they're getting political, or, oh, I mean, so like, what can we learn from a group that is, or a movement that is rooted in, very clear in its values, right? So to my earlier comments, naming our values and developing that messaging is key to getting others to join us and key to communicating to legislators. We have to do a lot of strategic work on naming the values that we hold and communicating in a way that they can be received. And then who's going to argue with the values of life and of flourishing and of abundance and of all these things that speak to care for creation. So really the messaging on values and the storytelling is pretty key here.
I appreciate each of you as you answered that and brought your perspective on it and your experience on it, that you didn't wait for permission necessarily from leadership to do this, that you took our permission is coming from the gospel itself and from our Catholic tradition. At the same time, there's often, and a lot of the questions are concerning around, sometimes we don't see this coming from our leadership actively, at least not in all of our dioceses or even our local parishes sometimes. And how are we to kind of confront that, if you will, or even work with that, even sometimes where we might even see examples of where our leadership might seem to be better friends with climate deniers than they are with some of the folks that are supporting what Pope Francis is inviting us to. How do we kind of live in that balance as faithful Catholics with our leadership and not wanting to write them off? I mean, we're not going to say the Catholic Climate Covenant. We're not saying we're writing off our leadership, but how do we work with that kind of that tension? Anybody want to take that? You know, that's a nice one. Well, let's leave that for anybody who wants to take that one. Everybody's quiet.
I can go first. Yeah. One of the things that I think is really important is what Pope Francis calls us to in Encounter, which is the title of this campaign, right? So by engaging in perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps somewhat confrontational dialogue with our leaders who are maybe not talking about the issue of climate change as much as we think they should, I think starting there and engaging in face-to-face conversations and truly encountering them, and not coming from a sort of antagonistic place, saying, like, accusing them of not, doing their job or being allied with climate deniers. I think sitting down and having a real connection and conversation about why our faith demands action, and why you may be disappointed in the lack of conversation about the issue. And I think the second piece of that is being comfortable in our faith and knowing that we have this call to action, and starting like as community members, and not necessarily waiting for our leaders to speak up about something, but sort of starting at the bottom level and going forth on our own. Yeah.
Great. That's good.
I-
Mary, please.
Sure, I'd also like to share, I think that storytelling is also a huge part of a starting point, really. I have had the blessing to be able to travel a lot and see for myself a lot of this environmental damage. I shared a couple of stories, and I have millions of more stories because of my travels on purposely going to see the effects of climate change and all the environmental damages happening in different parts of the world. I think what happens a lot is our people here, especially in the US, perhaps don't see the impact of environmental damage and climate change, besides some strange weather patterns. But for the most part, I think a lot of people don't get to witness that. So I think story sharing is a starting point, because it brings a face to the story, a face to the problem. And we as a church have so much resources on how we can bring about sharing those stories. I think of, and I think it's okay for me to mention Catholic Relief Services, but I do think of my travels to Malawi and seeing the effects of climate change through Catholic Relief Services and bringing back those stories. So again, I think of the experience I've had with speaking to people who are deniers, and just giving them the perspective of a story of who I've seen, what I've seen, and that this isn't something that is made up. It is happening to people out there, and it's happening to us. So many of us don't know about it. So I think, again, story sharing, storytelling could be a good starting point. Thank you.
I'll just add real quickly, and we have models. The University of Notre Dame just honored a woman named Sharon Levine from Louisiana, and her parish, St. James. So the Rise St. James is an environmental group that started because one day Sharon asked herself, why do my friends keep dying of cancer? And started to look into it. And her parish is located in what's known as Cancer Alley. And so it's a region along the Mississippi that is home to over 100 or so chemical plants and refineries. And so that it's all there, it's all happening. But to sort of do the digging to make the connections, and then to craft the stories to be able to communicate so that people can understand in tangible, concrete ways. We have models for that, and it is very powerful. And I think that to echo Miriam, the storytelling is essential when we engage pastors or church leaders. Not just the stories we bring, but we want to hear their stories too, right? We want to form a relationship. If this is all about encounter, how do we engage relationally and bring others into the work?
So one of the questions of encounter and story was asked even about some of our senators. Some of our senators we're going to go visit are going to be very supportive of the message we bring. They're already very supportive of it. And some of them may not. So how do we suggest kind of shaping the crafting of that message to bring our faith dimension to that, to kind of deepen and develop the encounter? And Michael, I'll turn to you first, and then maybe Emily, because I know you've been also involved in this, and then Mary, if you have things to add, that'd be great too.
Russ, were you saying for people that are already on board?
People are already on board, but we still want to go visit those senators. Why do we spend our time, visiting, my senator, Senator Van Hollen, and
Yeah.
Maryland. And he's
Great question.
Easy. It'd be a fun visit, but what does that do?
A couple of reasons why it's essential. First, as we say in organizing, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. So an ally today is maybe not going to be with us on an issue next week. And so, again, this is about relationship. It's not about one issue and that's it. So we engage on this particular issue, but we want to develop a relationship because it's a whole host of things that we want to ideally be in dialogue with our representatives throughout their tenure. Another reason is we want to learn what's working. So, okay, why are you for this? And who are your colleagues on either side, on that agree with you and then disagree with you? What are the talking points that people are agreeing on? What are the talking points that these are the issues that are these are the sorts of things that we really want to know as we think about this as a team, right? So it's not just me meeting with my one senator from Indiana, and that's it. To think about all the people on this call and all the people that are going to go forth as this sort of unified team, and then we learn from each other. So what happened in your meeting, and what did you hear from your senator, and who is she talking to, and then we compile all that information, right? Because we want to know, we want to ask the kinds of questions that will reveal the information that's going to be really helpful for us as we continue this, because nothing's going to happen overnight. But we want to think of ourselves as researchers going out, engaging, and bringing back the kinds of information that's going to help us move forward as we think strategically across the map.
Emily, anything to add or to that?
Yeah, I think Michael had a lot of good things to say. I think the only thing I would add would be the importance of sort of presenting ourselves in these meetings and these encounters as Catholics, and sort of inserting our Catholic faith into the discourse and into the conversation. So not only do our senators know that we're coming to this issue from a Catholic perspective, and that there's Catholics behind us who care about this issue and who think it's important for action, but if your senator is Catholic, that can appeal to them as well and sort of maybe make them think about these issues in different ways.
Great. Thank you. So a lot of different questions here. I'm trying to combine a few of them together. And kind of at least the way they're kind of piece of this is working at it. And so part of it is a matter of, I think, of when we think about this, is the different coalitions we're part of. Some of those that are also from when we bring our work we might do in our secular world. There's some people that are environmentalists, work for environmental groups and such, and those of us come from church. How do we kind of craft these kind of new kind of opportunities to work together? I think, and maybe that's also maybe kind of answering what we're trying to do with the Advocacy Action Platform, which is a part of how do we kind of carry that message forward. So how have you seen, I know Miriam, you were talking about some of the work with Catholic Relief Services. How have you seen this kind of merging of kind of working with our secular and our religious world kind of coming together as kind of a way of helping to move this campaign forward and to change forward?
Sure. I give the example of my local. I live in Connecticut, and there is an interreligious equal justice network, which is made up of all faith backgrounds. And we have come together in the last few years to really fight for environmental justice throughout the state, not just out in the globally, nationally, but our focus is in our state. So I think starting locally is the best way, just making that short connection, because really all faith backgrounds have a calling to care for creation. If we look at it as God's creation, and we are as the stewards and the caretakers. So I think that's a starting point with combating local issues. I know we did really well with banning plastic bags. So in the state of Connecticut, there are no use of plastic bags. We now have paper bags. It started with, extra 10 cents and now has moved forward to use of paper bags everywhere. So that was something small but significant. And it was because of this networking that we did, that someone took initiative, and I just followed through, and a lot of us joined. But I think, again, just to echo what I just said, starting locally, just reaching out with that phone call, organizing and combating those local issues.
And maybe, Emily, if you could add, how have you seen that being done? You've been as a youth, a younger activist. I'm going to say this, so you've been at this a long time. So you're not a new activist, but a younger activist. How have you seen this kind of connection between different groups, and kind of how have you seen that coalescing going, and how does it give us strength to move forward in our combined message?
Yeah, I think the issue itself is so large. It's not going to be solved in any way by any one effort or group or even legislative visit, right? So it's sort of a combined effort, and it requires us to work together and to play on each other's strengths, like between groups, between faiths, between secular and religious efforts. I think too, Pope Francis says it's all interconnected, right? So efforts to advance environmental justice can aid and complement efforts to advance economic justice or other areas of social justice. And so I think the key is recognizing the ways in which everything is interconnected, issues are interconnected, and also advocacy efforts can be interconnected, and seeing ways that things can connect to not then reinvent the wheel, but work together in different ways.
Great, thank you. Michael, anything you would add from your experience of how do you work across coalitions? We've been building coalitions that we don't have to wait for permission to use.
Invitation. We just last week at the University of Notre Dame hosted Faith in Action, which is a national group, with Network, our friends, Catholic lobbying group in DC, with the Indiana Catholic Conference, with the Indiana Poor People's Campaign, so even sort of non-religious groups, and then another Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, an environmental group at the southern end of the state. And we all have our sort of top priorities, but every group the issues are not that wide ranging. Fundamentally, climate justice is on the minds of a lot of people, and folks are working hard on it. And that work is so much more powerful if it's coordinated. And so invitation to work together. And I think that's exciting prospect for us here in Indiana. And with the number of Catholic groups that are caring about these things, and somebody in the chat referenced Network, I think there's just a lot of opportunity, a lot of good things are happening, and there's more opportunity for building those relationships, because with more relationships, there's more power, and we need power to make these changes.
That's great, thanks. We're gonna start trying to bring this to a close. I want to ask each of the speakers to kind of close with one thought on what keeps you having hope to continue this. As you think about how you're going to answer that in 2 sentences or less. One thing, we didn't get to all the questions on the list. We're going to try to answer some of the very specific ones. We're asking very specific resources and such. We'll try to get to you answers to those of you who asked that. Again, this webinar is being recorded, and the other resources that hopefully go with it can be a part of that. And then we'll talk more about that and some other kind of next steps in a second. Miriam, I guess we'll start with you. We'll kind of keep our order going. If you could say, what gives you the hope to continue this? I think that's an important thing for us to, as we kind of move on together from this.
Sure. For me personally, it's my kids. We go on hikes all the time, and we're just nature lovers to begin with. So I look at them and I think about their futures in all seriousness, and I they give me the hope to keep working at this, and also encountering other families. I see a lot more families with home gardens, and just recognizing that significance of nature, and of growing your own food, and little action steps like that. I think that gives me a lot of hope. A lot of people are aware of what's happening, and a lot of people want the change. So I know there's hope there. We just have to wake them and shake them up to do something about it.
Thank you. Emily, what keeps you hope in this journey together?
Yeah, sort of similar to Miriam. I think it's community, and I think particular for me, community with other young people who care about climate change, other young Catholics who care about climate change. It's really easy to be sort of overcome by despair and anxiety when you start thinking about the nitty-gritty realities of climate change and what my future is going to be like, what my children's future is going to be like. But I've found that happens in isolation, and what happens in community is a hope for action now, a hope for action in the future, and a better future.
Great. Thank you. And finally, last but not least, Michael, please.
So Father Gustavo Gutierrez says, the journey of the people of God is set in motion with encounter, both in the Lord and community. And so I'm really grateful for today and the conversation and this framing of encounter, because it is the relationships that sustain the work. I mean, we lose all the time, but when we win big. And all the while we're supporting each other and learning. It's sacred work to tap into one's own story, to tell it, to listen to the story of another, and through those stories build the relationships that fuel the work that is so necessary. So in a word, Russ, encounter.
See, I wrote down 4 words. I was going to say, like, checking out of this: encounter and invitation. So you already took my one word there. And welcome, stories, and the strategic solidarity. I kept hearing that kind of as the ways I kept hearing some words for this forward. So again, with everybody, I want to thank you as our time comes to an end. They're making me end this. I want to thank Miriam, Emily, and Michael for your input. It's just been incredible being a part of this. I'm very humbled and kind of all a jitter. I get all excited by these things. Just so you know, just to kind of keep this, this is the first of 2 webinars to get us ready for this encounter visits. The visits we're trying to get set up with our senators between May 2nd and 6th as a way of kind of trying to move the agenda forward on climate change. So if you have not signed up for the campaign, if you haven't done so yet, or if you want to make sure you need to sign up for the next webinar, that can be done through godsplanet.us. That's the kind of overarching kind of US site to kind of help collate our work around the Odyssey Action Platform. And this work is a part of that. The register for next week's meeting, we're going to ask next Tuesday, what the actual ask is and why we're asking it now. Why we infuse the legislative visits with this culture of encounter. What's the roadmap for our successful campaign? So what are the steps to having a really good invitation to kind of build those relationships? And then also why we're kind of using some tailored approaches to our senators that we talked about. There's a way for us to do that. Then the last piece of it's kind of how we can use social media as a way of amplifying this within our church and within our world. Spread the word about this to all your communities. Right now, we have over 650 people that are registered in 48 states and territories. Our senators are going to hear from us. They're going to hear from this authentic Catholic voice. They're going to hear from this moral voice. They're going to feel this invitation to encounter, I think, from us as this way of trying to invite us into a new way. This truly, for me, one of the things that excites me about this is truly part of a nonviolent movement for change. We often don't think about advocacy in that way, but that advocacy being that nonviolent, that way of kind of creating communications that's nonviolent with each other to kind of invite us to that next sense of encounter. So please be willing to share this with others. And like I said, the recordings will be up soon and sent to everybody. This is such an exciting time. If you have any questions, you can always email us at info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. And then a last bit of thanks again to our speakers, Miriam, Emily and Michael, and then also to those you don't see behind the scenes that have been a part of this campaign. Paz and Henry and Jose have kind of done a lot of the behind the scenes work to make this all look seamless. I get to just kind of read things and do this together. So it's been easy for me to be there with you. And I also want to thank all of you who were able to attend this with us or be able to watch it later. It's great to be in this journey with you as we try to bring this encounter to our common home forward. So thank you very much.